December 5th, 1952. Londoners woke to a familiar sight. Fog. Thick, heavy, and clinging to the city streets, fog was as iconic to London as its red buses or the chime of Big Ben. But something about this fog was different. It was darker, heavier, and harsher on the lungs. By midday, the city was struggling to function, and by nightfall, it became clear this wasn't just another winter fog. It was something far more dangerous. The fog settled in a way that was almost otherworldly. Streets disappeared into an endless haze. Drivers found themselves navigating blind, leaning out of their car windows in a desperate attempt to see a few feet ahead. Some abandoned their vehicles altogether. Trains stopped running, flights were grounded, and buses couldn't leave their depots. Even ambulances were rendered useless in the chaos. Shops and theaters tried to stay open, but few braved the streets. Visibility dropped so low that people carried flashlights at noon, and the beams barely penetrated the dense, yellowish-gray air. There were reports of people getting lost just blocks from their homes, wandering aimlessly in a fog that had turned their city unrecognizable. At first, people made light of it. They had dealt with fog before, after all. London's pea soupers, as they were nicknamed, had been part of the city's charm for centuries. But this was no ordinary fog. It stung the eyes and scratched at the throat. Breathing became a struggle, especially for children, the elderly, and those with existing health conditions. Inside homes, things weren't much better. The fog seeped through cracks in windows and doors, carrying with it a sharp, acrid smell. Families huddled around coal stoves, unwittingly feeding the toxic air outside. By nightfall, the city was suffocating both inside and out. Over the next 5 days, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from severe respiratory issues. Doctors reported cases of acute bronchitis, pneumonia, and even asphyxiation. But the healthcare system, already strained by post-war shortages, couldn't keep up. Reports came in of livestock dropping dead in the fields. Markets full of poultry and pigs saw entire flocks succumb to the air. Birds, too, fell from the sky. The smog was indiscriminate, choking every living thing in its path. But what caused such devastation? London's dependence on coal held the answer. Post-war Britain relied heavily on coal for heating, industry, and electricity. But this wasn't the high-grade coal of earlier decades. Faced with economic challenges, households and industries turned to cheaper, low-quality coal, packed with impurities. When burned, it released vast amounts of sulfur dioxide, soot, and other pollutants. Usually, these pollutants would disperse into the atmosphere, carried away by winds. But in early December, an atmospheric phenomenon called a temperature inversion occurred. Cold air near the ground became trapped under a layer of warmer air above, creating a lid that sealed the pollution close to the earth. As more chimneys poured smoke into the air, the smog thickened, growing more toxic by the hour. What made this disaster particularly tragic was that it was entirely preventable. London had experienced severe fogs before, and the risks of air pollution were no secret. Still, industrial progress was prioritized over public health. Clean air was not seen as a right, but as a luxury, one that a recovering economy couldn't afford to prioritize. By December 9th, when the weather shifted and the smog finally lifted, the toll was staggering. Initial reports estimated around 4,000 deaths. Later research would revise that number to closer to 12,000, with an additional 100,000 people falling ill. This wasn't just a weather event. It was one of the deadliest environmental disasters in human history. The aftermath sparked outrage. People demanded to know how such a catastrophe could have been allowed to happen. The government, initially reluctant to admit fault, launched investigations into the disaster. The results were a damning indictment of London's industrial practices and urban planning. The Great Smog became a catalyst for change. 4 years later, the Clean Air Act of 1956 was passed. This landmark legislation introduced measures to control air pollution, including the creation of smokeless zones where the use of coal was restricted. It also encouraged households and industries to transition to cleaner fuels like gas and electricity. The act didn't solve all of London's air quality issues overnight, but it marked a turning point in the city's environmental policy. The legacy of the Great Smog extends far beyond the boundaries of London. It was one of the first events to highlight the deadly consequences of unchecked industrial pollution and the need for government intervention. It inspired other cities around the world to adopt stricter air quality standards, paving the way for modern environmental movements. But could it happen again? The conditions that created the Great Smog, heavy industrial pollution, temperature inversions, and a reliance on dirty fuels, still exist in parts of the world today. In fact, severe air pollution events have occurred in places like Beijing, Delhi, and Lahore, where rapid industrial growth and urbanization have outpaced environmental protections. In 2013, Beijing experienced an event dubbed the airpocalypse, where levels of fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, reached 40 times the limit recommended by the World Health Organization. Schools and factories were shut down, flights were canceled, and people were urged to stay indoors. Like the Great Smog, it was a wake-up call about the cost of unchecked development. The difference today is that we have the knowledge and technology to prevent such disasters. Advanced air quality monitoring, stricter emissions standards, and cleaner energy sources are tools that weren't available in 1952. Yet the question remains, do we have the collective will to use them? The Great Smog of London wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lesson in the power and the consequences of human activity. It showed how fragile our relationship with the environment can be and how much is at stake when that balance is disrupted. The story of the Great Smog isn't just history. It's a reminder for the present and a warning for the future.